Aetherfall, Episode 1.2, Dark Tides. 1.
Prima blocked the attacker's strike. He parried the right hook with the arm angled up against his head. The attacker howled as his knuckles shattered against Prima's armored forearm guard. Prima pressed the advantage, stepped forward, and from the hip drove the elbow of the arm he had just used to block down onto the attacker's temple. The man crashed to the ground. He noticed the second attacker more by instinct than sight, ducked, and in the same motion drew a throwing knife and immediately hurled it in the direction where he assumed the attacker to be. As the blade left his hand, the attacker was already emerging from behind the pillar. The perfect timing allowed the man no further action. The knife pierced the visor and sank to the hilt into his skull. He dropped. Prima sprang up, took 2 strides toward the window, and leapt. In midair, he drew his pistol and fired a single round into the window ahead of him. He flew through it, holstered his weapon in the air, checked the contents of his chest pocket, and then assumed an elegant flight posture. Legs together, arms spread wide like a cross, he shot toward the ground like an arrow. His helmet visor spat all kinds of information at him. Distance to ground, position of his glider, position of his student, temperature, alarm status. With a blink, he banished all of it and left only 2 data points: Kanish's position and altitude. His speed kept increasing. He activated the winglets on his bodysuit. The fall slowed, and he followed Kanish's moving position. When that location aligned with a transporter visible on his visor, the vehicle was automatically designated as the new primary target, and data was pulled up. He narrowed his eyes and steered toward the transporter. An approach timer displayed his arrival at target. ETA. 4 seconds. Prima braced himself. At the last moment, he slowed himself with the auxiliary winglets of his armor. The abrupt deceleration created several meters of distance between him and the transporter. He aimed his fist at the transporter's rear loading hatch and fired the magnetic hook of his launcher at it while still in the air. He activated the launcher's coil with a wink, and even as he was being reeled violently toward the transporter, he drew his weapon and fired 2 precise shots at the loading hatch door, which exploded and freed his hook. The momentum was still enough, and Prima landed inside the open transporter with deadly elegance. He isolated the 2 soldiers, who had not yet fully understood what was happening and were still dazed by the explosion of the door. 2 shots to the heads of the soldiers ended any further action. He holstered his weapon and stepped toward Kanish, who sat bound to the bench inside the transporter. She raised her bound hands, and Prima deactivated the restraint. "The data?" Prima asked. "Secured," Kanish replied calmly. As they threw the driver of the transporter out the door and headed for their glider, Kanish turned from the passenger seat toward Prima and said, "See? I told you it was easier to use me as transport equipment, Primus," she said cheerfully. "That may be, but we could have solved it more easily as well," Prima said. "Don't worry, my Primus. Next time, I'll be the one rescuing you," Kanish replied brightly.
Prima felt grief, pain, rage. A slight jolt tore him from sleep. He had dozed off and was trying to orient himself. He could not remember the last time he had slept that deeply, and in public, no less, if one could even call a first-class cabin aboard this transporter public. He straightened up and looked out through the large panoramic window of his cabin. The massive structure of the warp gate and its enormous defensive batteries drifted past him. A warship, which he identified as a frigate, circled in the distance like a vigilant falcon, watching the new arrivals in the Axe system with care. A routine procedure Prima knew all too well. He gathered his thoughts and let the dream replay in his mind. The emotions it had brought with it clung to him like an oil film on the surface of water. That was not good,
he decided. Emotional attachment could cloud his judgment or bias him. The fact that the victim had been a former student did not make it any easier. He was unsettled and felt a deep, raw fury with a craving for vengeance. He closed his eyes, straightened his body, and quickly recited a mantra. Sword, veil, star, water, structure. He exhaled slowly and did not inhale again. His inner eye gradually shed all useless thoughts, and he forced his focus onto the here and now. Everything became clear. Darkness separated from light, emotions from facts, pain from understanding. Prima slowly opened his eyes. Resolve took hold of him, and his mind began to retrieve and sort with cold logic the facts and data he had spent days studying during the journey. The death of Primus Caniche would be clarified, the person responsible would be brought to justice, and the investigation into her case would be successfully concluded. This decision Prima made for himself banished all emotions deep into his inner self, and he felt clarity return. He looked out the window, and his gaze was drawn to the planet. Axe Prima, the homeworld of Solvarian and seat of the Emperor. At the thought of the Emperor, Prima shook his head. He did not like Solvarian. They were allies and always loyal, yes, but the arrogance that radiated from Emperor Tertius Auxilius was revolting. Sadly, that behavior had rubbed off on the legions of Solvarian as well. Well, not all of them, he thought. The Emperor's daughter, Athena Flava, herself princeps and supreme commander of the Legio Prima, was an exception. But however infamous the princeps might have been, her reserved and honourable manner unfortunately did not match the Solvarian standard. His transporter passed the planetary space station Lux Lever, the heart of the Solvarian defence system, and continued toward the planet. An announcement sounded, and a gently feminine voice informed the passengers of their imminent arrival at the spaceport on Axe Prima. Prima stowed away his hollow, smoothed his coat, pulled on his gloves, and rose. He walked toward the door, and stopped. One last time, he turned around and looked out the window at the planet growing larger and larger. "I will avenge you, my little one," he murmured softly. An hour later, he had arrived at his organization's safe house on the lower levels of Axe Prima. As an organizational HQ, it was professionally outfitted with everything necessary. The cover, an FTL propulsion and control workshop, had been put into operation over 200 years earlier and was running at full capacity. The uninterrupted delivery and pickup of spare parts, specialists and materials legitimized every arrival and departure of goods and personnel. The workshop extended over more than 3,000 square meters and employed over 200 engineers and workers. The HQ was located inside the workshop, within the planning hubs, in an office that concealed a simple, hidden door in the wall, leading to a sound and infra-isolated room. Simple. No grand command center, but effective. It had everything needed: wide area surveillance, weapons, and any necessary interrogations in the hidden room could be handled without interruption. A staff access route to the offices separated them from the workshop, allowing agents to come and go undisturbed. Prima sat in the office, flipping through the mission reports of Canish's previous operations on his hollow. He built a rough overview for himself and began noting down important information on his hollow. The door opened, and Kareem, the station commander, entered. He was a broad, tall man, whose age was beginning to show. His calm, steady demeanor, paired with streaks of grey in his hair, radiated security and authority. "The detailed autopsy report," he said, handing Prima the hollow. Prima pulled a copy onto his own hollow and offered Kareem's back to him. Kareem sat down in the chair opposite Prima. "We couldn't bring her back here. Solvarian security found her first, and then notified the commissioner's office, Karim said. He leaned back and fished his caustic out of his pocket. Cause of death, clean shot to the back of the head. Bruising and 2 fractures, Prima said, as he read the report and studied the images. Karim only nodded. Yes. We were able to remove her hollow and her weapons belt from the investigation as evidence. Our identity is therefore uncompromised. Her weapon was fully loaded. No access attempt had been made on her hollow, Karim said. She was taken by surprise. Prima voiced his first thought. Most likely, Karim agreed. Projectile weapon, small caliber. No exit wound, no cauterization or burn marks, Prima said, examining the autopsy images. Paralysis bolter, Karim said, merely voicing what Prima had just read in the report. Quiet and deadly. So the killer had been a trained marksman. Polaris bolters were not a rare weapon, but because they only held 3 shots, they were mostly favored by skilled shooters who valued silence and discretion. The logical conclusion would be an assassin or an enemy agent. That thought was further reinforced by the fact that Kanisha had been on the trail of a suspected terror cell, making a potential attacker from such, or a similar field, highly likely. Karim handed Prima a bracelet. Identification and papers are on it. You're a specialist for a current project, Karim said. Prima took it and fastened it around his wrist. I'll be honest with you. I've been station chief here for more than 43 years now. It was always quiet. Small altercations, smuggling, espionage affairs and so on. All of that was fine. We know it. It's daily business. But something is different. Primus Kanisha was on the trail of something big. I have no concrete proof, but something changed. Even before the Primus arrived, the illegal activities began to decline. Opis smuggling fell off, data theft from the organized sector as well. Contacts cut all communication or disappeared. All in all, it was as if the crime rate were dropping. So either the lawkeepers of Solvaris have invented the holy grail of social discipline, Karim said, or someone is recruiting and establishing structures. Prima finished the thought. Karim nodded. Prima thought for a moment. It fit the picture. Karim's assumption was correct, he decided. He would have to dig deeper into the matter, and that could not be done from a hollow and a data panel. I'll take a look at the crime scene and form my own picture, he said. Of course. Weapons and equipment are in the safe. For emergency evacuation, the phrase is Nautis, Karim said. Prima nodded, stood, and set off. 2. Prima found that he liked Axe Prima. The planet was beautiful, and the remarkable harmony between nature and civilization was reflected everywhere he looked. Even the capital was an impressive macro city. More than 8 million people lived here in Aksavid alone. That in itself would not have been remarkable, since there were dozens of cities with such population density. No, what was remarkable was the above-average cleanliness and quality of life, even on the lower levels of the city. Because unlike other macro cities, where the illusion of prosperity already faded by the second sublevel, Aksavid did not give that impression. It was clean. The people were disciplined, and the city radiated a strange kind of calm. He sensed no hectic rush anywhere. The people were happy, Prima thought. He turned with his speeder into one of the tiered streets and descended another level. His thoughts processed all the information he had gathered over the past hours. Like on an enormous white canvas, it was all pinned before his mind's eye. But the red threads had not yet been drawn. The connection was missing. The navigation display in his helmet lit up, and he came to a halt. He decided he would take the last 2 levels and the remaining distance on foot. It was an old habit, taught to him by his former Primus. Let your surroundings work on you, and you'll see details you would otherwise overlook, Primus Hatina had drilled into him again and again. And the old Primus had been right. Prina was able to focus better when he familiarized himself with his surroundings and associated himself with them. Upon reaching the 10th sub-level of Axavid, the cityscape changed. Here there was the dark, grimy and dirty atmosphere he knew all too well from other macro-cities, though it lacked the sheer mass of people found elsewhere. It was mostly warehouses, factories, and worker hubs that made their home here. Prina did not despise it. He understood the general interaction between prosperity and the effort required to sustain it. This was an important part of Axavid's lifeblood. Cheap labor, cheap production. Simply put, the economy and all its usual nuances. Inside his helmet, he heard that he was almost at his destination. It was a long side alley between two large factory halls. Trash, old containers, and various half-stripped vehicles had simply been dumped in the alley. It was dark. The sewage shafts constantly belched steam, and the missing street lighting reinforced the generally grim and dangerous atmosphere this place radiated. Prina looked around and scanned the alley. No life signs. He proceeded carefully through the alley until he reached his objective. He spotted the crime scene immediately. The circle left by the forensic team's plasma scanner, which scanned and recorded all particles within a 2-meter radius, formed a stark visual contrast with the otherwise filthy ground around it. Even the missing streetlight could not hide it. Prina looked around. Bewilderment gripped his thoughts. There was nothing here. The factories to the left and right of the street rose like enormous walls, with no windows or doors. And the main street, and at the same time the only entrance to the alley, was more than 100 meters away. Kanish had not been a novice, and even one would have spotted a pursuer immediately. Yet his former student had not only been followed, but shot from behind. Beneath his helmet, Prina grimaced. He crouched and analyzed everything. His mind absorbed every detail from the surroundings. On the white canvas in his mind, all the data and information he had gathered darted about. The autopsy report pushed itself to the front, and the 2 fractures were highlighted. He looked up at the empty space where the missing streetlight should have been. The thought had already taken shape in his mind, and the answer was merely waiting for confirmation. He looked around and found it. The shattered lamp housing not far from the crime scene. Of course, he thought. You didn't see the killer because you weren't even down here. He looked up at the edge of the factory roof. With practiced routine, Prina checked the alley once more, made sure it was still empty, aimed his arm at the top edge of the building, and fired a hook. He activated the coil and was yanked upward with a violent jerk. Once on top, he looked around. The surrounding rooftops were empty. Here and there stood exhaust hoods and signal amplifiers atop the factory halls, but otherwise, nothing. Prina crouched and searched for tracks on the ground, and in fact he discovered a few footprints in the grime. He examined them and followed the tracks in the direction they seemed to have come from. No sooner had he turned his head toward the footprints than a figure sprang up from below, apparently using the exact same route he had. Prina stared at the figure in surprise. The figure froze when it saw him. Prina tensed. He could not let the figure escape. In a single motion, he lunged at it, and, to his greatest astonishment, it did the same. Prina was not entirely sure whether he was the hunter or the hunted. That thought formed in him after what was now the 4th exchange of blows with the masked figure, because he was not used to anyone holding out this long against him in an unarmed duel. That suggested a qualified individual, with skills on par with his, or perhaps better. As that thought took shape in his mind, he drove a hip-turned kick into the attacker's solar plexus. The figure was hurled back several steps, rolled backward, and came up elegantly to its feet again. Prina studied the figure. It rose slowly. Something in its posture had changed. The initial dominant attack stance had become something else, as though it were now regarding Prina with respect and the recognition of an equal opponent. Funny, Prina thought, having unconsciously reached the exact same conclusion. The figure tilted its head slightly to the left. It drew a sword hilt from its belt, activated it, and a black blade unfolded from the hilt with a crackle. The figure held the sword parallel to itself, angled toward the ground. Its stance radiated nothing but challenge. Prina's suspicion that these were no amateurs had now been confirmed. The black blade, the trademark of the Mglari. He wanted to let his thoughts run further, to connect causality and meaning and, with this new realization, paint a complete logic tapestry before his mind's eye and understand all the connections at once. His instinct dragged his thoughts back into the here and now. Sword, veil, star, he recited instinctively, the first 3 phrases of his mantra moving through his mind, took a deep breath, drew 2 short daggers from his hip holster, and assumed a fighting stance. His mind shut out everything around him except the attacker. The hairs on the back of his neck rose, as his intellect fed him every essential detail about his opponent and calculated his odds of victory. Stance, equipment, behavior, location, timing, fighting style. Final result? His mind delivered a crystal-clear assessment. Survival probability under 30%. He narrowed his eyes, hardened his will, and prepared himself. One of them would die now. Prina barely registered the first 3 strikes. The attacker was so fast with the blade that he could rely only on training and instinct. Black-blue sparks flew as the black blade was parried by Prina's daggers. The attacker dominated the duel, slowly forcing Prina back. One attack series after another rained down on him. He knew his only chance was a perfectly executed counter, so he paid attention to his footwork, parried, dodged, and defended. He detected a pattern in his opponent's movements and adapted it into his defense instantly. For a brief time, it looked as though Prina's tactic might bear fruit and the Mglari would bog down against his defensive rhythm. Then he was handed the bill for his premature misjudgment. The movement the Mglari had already used 4 times before to strengthen his vertical strikes was suddenly feinted. The opponent ducked and executed a wide, slicing spin with a full 360-degree turn. Prina noticed the positional shift too late and tried to evade while moving backward. Too late. The Mglari's blade cut several centimeters into his thigh. Prina suppressed the burning pain and parried 2, 3 more strikes. The attacker did not rest on his small success and continued pressing forward. The Mglari feinted another attack, made a lunge step to the left combined with a feint, and brought down a 2-handed strike from the left. Prina had to parry the blow with both blades, and now realized what the Mglari had really intended. He had forced Prina's weight onto his wounded leg. Prina knew he would not survive another attack. He decided that the rules of the duel were very honorable, but currently of little practical use to him. He rolled backward and flung his daggers at the Mglari during the retreat, forcing him to parry. While still rolling, he drew his pistol from his thigh holster and, once back on his feet, opened fire. The Mglari evaded the first shots with cat-like reflexes and rolled aside. Just as Prina was about to fire the second volley, he noticed a hovering object behind the Mglari, rushing toward them at tremendous speed. The Mglari glanced over his shoulder at the glider approaching them, then looked back at Prina. Prina had him in his sights, but did not fire. The Mglari held his gaze for another second, then sprang sideways and fled into the darkness. The speeder, evidently belonging to Solvarian security, lit up the fleeing Mglari and gave chase. The loudspeaker ordered him to halt, but the Mglari showed no sign of complying. Prina used the opportunity and dropped himself over the roof edge back down into the alley. Limping slightly, he fled the alley. He had first intended to disappear immediately, but instead decided to let the situation cool and turned into the next side alley. He judged a storage hub to be the perfect temporary hiding place in which to tend to himself and wait briefly. It was a half-covered storage area used as a transfer or holding station. It was only dimly lit, and the many empty containers and piles of garbage against the walls offered, under cover of darkness, the security he needed for the moment. He hid, sealed his open wound with spray skin, and drew a short breath. He leaned against the inside wall of an empty container and listened outside. No pursuers. He briefly weighed the possibility of evacuation, but after a short analysis, saw no need for it. It would probably kick up more dust than necessary, and given the powers now involved here, dust was the last thing Prina needed. His thoughts wanted to race, flood him with information, overwhelm him, but he held them back. He recited his mantra again, once, twice, and on the third repetition, calm returned to his mind. He closed his eyes and let his perception expand. He rested, relaxed. Patience. He would need patience, Prina decided. He waited about an hour before daring to emerge from the storage hub and his hiding place. The effect of the spray skin and the local sedative it contained had taken hold. He felt little pain and could put weight on the leg again. He retraced the same route by which he had come, past the alley from which he had fled a good hour earlier, and was already about to make his way toward the upper levels when he saw a woman turn into the alley he had come from. Prina stopped and slipped behind a transporter parked at the roadside so he could observe her. Something about the woman had struck him as odd. He could not yet place it, but he had been doing this work far too long not to trust his instincts completely. The woman vanished into the alley. He crossed the street and followed her, but when he reached the alley, it was empty. He looked around and saw only a door and a large closed gate leading into a storage hub a few steps from where he stood. He looked upward, but saw neither windows nor ventilation shafts on the hub's wall. He waited a few minutes and decided to follow through the door. It was locked, but not a real challenge. After a few practiced movements, he had already bypassed it, slipped inside, and closed it behind him again. The door led into a small antechamber of a warehouse, and then through a corridor into a large storage section. The warehouse was enormous and full of goods of every kind, stacked up to the ceiling in the racks intended for them. It was quiet. Sparse lighting between the shelving systems marked the individual aisles, wide enough for the loading machines to move containers in and out. Prina slipped through the aisles until he finally saw the woman in the 7th row. She was not alone. Another masked figure was with her, and the two were gesturing wildly at one another. Since nothing could be heard, Prina was fairly sure one of them had activated a sound dampening field. He climbed one of the shelves not far from the two figures and tried to establish visual contact. After a few moments, he found the perfect position from which he could see both figures clearly. He activated his helmet zoom, and instantly he could see the face of one of them. The other stood with its back to him. He started the recording function and at the same time read the lips of the young woman, who was obviously arguing heatedly with the other figure.
"Discover it, then we are fucked! Fucked, I'm telling you!"
he read from the young woman's lips. She was visibly upset, nervous. No, not nervous. She was afraid. She paced back and forth, gesturing, and Prina could catch fragments of her lips here and there.
"Arrives? And now this?"
The young woman turned away from the figure. It grabbed her and turned her back around to face it. Clearly the figure was talking to her. She lowered her gaze only briefly before saying, tears in her eyes.
I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do. We just can't fail now. We've almost made it.
Another pause followed.
Good,
the woman said with a nod.
Yes, 6 days should be enough.
The sound-dampening field deactivated, and the masked figure turned to leave the aisle. The young woman watched it go, still visibly shaken. Prina, lying atop the shelving, tried to estimate the direction in which the masked figure had left the room, and was already about to move, when another figure detached itself from the shadows and went to the woman.
And?
Asked the newcomer, a bald, middle-aged man. The woman shook her head.
She'll handle it,
was all she said.
I hope so,
the man replied. The two of them left the warehouse in the opposite direction, clearly heading for another exit.
Or we're all dead,
Prina still heard the man say. Prina weighed his options briefly. He decided to follow the two of them. The man clearly needed to talk, and unlike the masked figure, he was an amateur. Besides, the other figure had already been gone for more than 2 minutes. He would not find it anymore. Well then, Prina answered the question he had asked himself earlier on the rooftop. Now I am the hunter.
3. Karim Benjaini was not a man who was easily impressed. He had been station chief on Axe for 47 years, and was therefore responsible for all of Axe Prima and the entire Axe star system, and he had seen far too much. He was calm, and always acted with an almost inexplicable composure. Epic heroics, boasting, and soldiers' tales meant nothing to him. He knew far too well the price paid for heroism and such stories. And yet, he had to admit it. Primus Aprina Olmeni impressed him. The man possessed a calm, an efficiency, or perhaps simply a presence, that stood in such stark contrast to his actions that Karim could barely comprehend it. He had arrived on Axe roughly 10 hours ago, with no information about social structures, gangs, contacts, or informants. And now, a naked man, apparently belonging to a terror cell not yet fully identified, sat tied to a chair in the interrogation room, with 2 severed fingers laid out neatly on the table before him. The Primus had dragged him into the interrogation room 2 hours earlier, and only come back out 5 minutes ago, washed his hands, and asked for tea. Karim brought him the tea, and sat down across from him on the sofa in the office. He took 2 deep pulls on his Nikos stick, and waited. He knew the Primus would speak when he had sorted his thoughts.
Well then,
Aprina said, setting his tea down.
You must help me,
said the Primus. He opened his trousers and pulled them down.
When I said that I could get you anything you needed,
Karim said, twisting his expression into a grin. The Primus paused, understood the scene, merely smirked and said,
I thought you wanted a promotion.
Aprina sat and laid his left leg on the table. Now Karim saw what he meant. A pink streak ran a good 8 centimeters across his thigh, where the synthetic skin and its sedative were battling the wound and an infection. Karim stood at once and went into the adjoining office to fetch a medkit.
My apologies,
he said, and began tending the wound.
Can we establish a secure line to HQ from here, or do I need to go to the warp gate?
Aprina asked.
We have a phase-secured dual-com link to the gate. We can send from here,
said Karim, removing the false skin and filling and smoothing the wound with biopaste.
Good. Then please file a request for an emergency briefing, starting in...
Aprina glanced at his chrono.
Starting in 45 minutes.
Karim looked at the Primus and nodded in confirmation.
Hold this,
he said, handing him the bio-stick with which the paste could be hardened using UVS light. He went to the hollow terminal in the office and requested the desired communication with HQ. Whatever the Primus had discovered, it was serious. Kareem had only ever requested a transstellar emergency briefing once before, more than 17 years ago, and the conflict with Asares that followed had lasted for years. "Sent," Kareem said. Prina nodded. "I need to order my thoughts before the briefing. You'll be present, so I won't have to repeat myself. I need a moment of quiet now," said the Primus. "Of course," Kareem said, and left him alone. 40 minutes later, Kareem entered the room again, made sure the Primus was awake and wearing trousers, and established the connection. A voice came from the holo projector. "Identification," Kareem said. "K76612ZB. Prina said, "A000340. "Confirmed," said the voice. The holo came to life and projected the image of a slender old woman. "Report," the woman demanded. Her tone was iron, hard, and her voice carried an echo of authority. She was direct and efficient, sparing with words, just as one expected from a matron. She spoke only when necessary. Prina cleared his throat. "Arrival according to planning protocol. Investigation in the case of Primus Caniche commenced. Urgent briefing convened. Reason, suspected attack on Solvaris," Prina said matter-of-factly.
The matron waited a few moments. Kareem knew she would now weigh her options. Perhaps recall the Primus for the emergency report, or, if she deemed it necessary, continue the briefing. It was standard procedure. Only the necessary was communicated over long-range comms. And even if it was their own warp gates maintaining the connection, there remained a general distrust of digital information flow. Kareem knew all too well what a digital fingerprint could set in motion, and one could never be too careful. "Very well. Details, Primus?" the matron finally said. Prina nodded. He laid out his findings of the past 10 hours. At the mention of the Mglari, Kareem's breath caught briefly. The mention of the prisoner and his partial confession were facts that could not be dismissed, and Kareem now understood why the Primus had called the briefing. The matron remained silent for a full minute as she absorbed Prina's information and the weight of what it implied. "Let me summarize. Mglari are operating on Axe Prima. A terror cell has been confirmed, though not yet fully identified. A possible attack on an unknown target within the Axe star system is imminent." Prina nodded. This was bad, Kareem decided. The terror cell alone was no great drama, but the fact that it was apparently protected by Mglari, the assassins of Asarian, changed everything. One did not simply send these killers on ordinary assassination missions. They were highly professional fighters who executed the will and authority of Razlan Asarian, the Emperor of Asares. If Mglari were here, then only because the Emperor of Asarian wanted them here. And that could mean nothing good. "We cannot contact Solvaris intelligence directly. That would compromise our carefully established outpost. We will use unofficial channels and warn them," said the matron. "I also believe that Caniche lost her life because she came to a similar conclusion," Prina said. "Measured against your report, that seems likely, yes," the matron confirmed. "When is the planned departure of the Solvaris expedition?" she asked Kareem. "Princeps Athena Flava Solvarian intends to depart before her father's festivities, so in 2 days," Kareem confirmed. "Festivities?" Prina asked. "The wedding and state banquet of Emperor Tertius Auxilius Solvaris and the daughter of Mikos Gergos, Castellan of Avalon, in 1 week. The princeps despises Avalon and hates her father's political marriage with all her heart, at least according to our current understanding," Kareem said. Prina straightened. He pulled out his holo and skimmed the recording from the warehouse. He started the segment where the young woman had been speaking with the masked figure.
6 days should be enough.
Prina repeated the words he had read from the young woman's lips.
I don't know how you see it, matron, but I suspect an attack on the wedding,
Prina said. Karim could follow the Primus's logic. It would be the perfect target. Officials, nobility, and the leadership of Solvaris and Avalon would all be present. It would also explain the presence of the Mglari. The matron narrowed her eyes, presumably reaching the same conclusion.
Primus, your primary mission is hereby changed. The integrity of our system HQ on Axe Prima now has highest priority. We cannot warn Solvaris officially. Until this information reaches their intelligence service through irregular channels, it will certainly take 2 to 3 days. Prevent the departure of the Princeps, at any cost. She is the only drop of reason in Solvaris leadership to whom we would entrust crisis management, said the matron. Contact for update tomorrow, same time.
Without waiting for a response, the hollow vanished and the connection ended. Karim drew a deep breath. If Osiris is planning an attack, then it won't unfold only on a planetary level. I'll contact the Fermi system. It is the only border system adjacent to Osiris, close enough and with a direct route here, said Karim.
Good,
said Prina, and stood. He went back into the interrogation room. 2 hours later, Karim met the Primus in the office again. He laid the report on the table. The report from Fermi, said Karim. He studied the hologram standing before the Primus. It was a gigantic image of a space station and dozens of docked battleships. Karim recognized the Lux Lever, the space fortress of Axe Prima. Also docked at the spaceport were 4 transports, each towing massive segments of a warp gate. The expedition the Princeps was preparing to lead was meant to establish a new jump route in one system. The fleet assembled here existed solely to protect that undertaking.
The Primus zoomed in on one of the transports and examined it. You suspect an attack on the expedition? Karim asked. Prina opened a file. Karim said, I considered that too, but it doesn't fit the timeline. The Princeps wanted to depart in 2 days. According to the communication of the suspects, the event is planned for 6 days from now. Interesting choice of words, Prina murmured. Karim examined the document Prina had now enlarged on the hollow. Prina said, System Directive 87A/33, Solvaris. Security protocol in the event of attack and sabotage against system-relevant infrastructure in core systems, serving the fundamental supply of economy and military. Karim followed the markings Prina had made in the text, and paused when the Primus highlighted the section, System-wide lockdown. Karim looked at the Primus and froze. Karim Benjaini reminded himself that yes, he could in fact be shaken from his composure, at least by the man standing before him. He already suspected what was coming next. I have in fact considered it as a target, said Prina with a hellish grin. On the hollow, one of the transports towing a warp gate segment was enlarged, and a damage projection from a small detonation was being simulated across it. Aetherfall continues. Episode 1.3, coming soon.